Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Jordan Camp. Conjuncture is a monthly webcast featuring interviews with scholars, artists, activists, and public intellectuals. I'm delighted to be here with Professor Anthony Bogues, Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory and Africana Studies, as well as Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice here at Brown University. He is the author of many works, including Caliban's Freedom, The Early Political Thought of C.L.R. James, Black Heretics and Black Prophets, Radical Political Intellectuals, and Empire of Liberty, among many other important works. Bogues engages what he calls the Black radical intellectual tradition and its distinctive critique of racial capitalism, of colonialism, and of the theory of history. In Black Heretics and Black Prophets, he distinguishes their framing of history as a, quote, a now between the past and the future, unquote. This conception of history as now time provides the grounds for challenging what has become a dominant narrative of the history of slavery and of capitalism, and instead offers what he calls a critique of the present. I'm very excited to talk with him today about the Black radical intellectual tradition and the critique of the present. So thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Tony.
Thanks very much, Jordan. It's really great to be speaking to you. And I'm actually honored that you asked me to do this. And so thanks.
Thank you. Well, I want to begin by asking you to reflect on some of the challenges of the current conjuncture. I mean, the global economic crisis, the failure of the state to contain the pandemic, and the widespread protests sparked by racism and police violence has shaken the confidence of the powerful. Now, there are different ways of interpreting this crisis, but as Stuart Hall instructed us, the most productive is as a conjuncture, which, he defines for us as an accumulation of contradictions that kind of merge into a ruptural unity. And that's the kind of moment that we're in. So to ground our conversation, can you offer us some of the contours of the current conjuncture?
Yeah, I think there's, Jordan, what is important is that a lot of us think of conjuncture as a moment, which it is, but also think of the moment as a kind of today, rather than understanding that a moment can actually be over a period of time, a kind of elongated moment, if you want to use that phrase. And so in trying to think about this conjuncture, I like to go back to late 1970s, 1980 specifically. And I go back to 1980 specifically because when you look around the world in 1980, you see in Europe Helmut Kohl. You see in United States the President Reagan will win the November election. And then you see in United Kingdom Mrs. Thatcher. And I would want to put it to you that trio of politicians represent politically the coming together of a set of contradictions in capitalism in the world, but also represented a certain fight back against what the bourgeoisie, I would want to argue, to use that phrase, the elites, if you want to use that phrase, were worried about in the 1960s and part of the 70s. And part of that worry had to do with decolonization. Part of that worry had to do with 68 in Paris. Part of that worry had to do with the black struggles in the United States. Part of that had to do with the African liberation movements. So that there was a concern that somehow the world that had arrived at some kind of settlement in the 1940s after the Second World War was now falling apart, and that they needed to reconsolidate the elite power and the bourgeois rule and the rule of capital, I would argue, over the world. And so that I think that what the Thatcher and Reagan and Kohl inaugurated or symbolized was the actual formal inauguration within the formal political systems of neoliberalism. And that neoliberalism was both an economic, had an economic side to it. That was the side in which there was one would call the emergence of fundamental markets, a kind of fundamental understanding of markets as the only thing that matters. The elaboration of and deepening of our understanding of the human species, only and primarily Homo economicus, but also had a ideological aspect to it. And that ideological aspect really can be summed up very much in Thatcher's words: there is no society, there are only individuals. Right? And so that kind of ideological and economic, or those kind of either economic and ideological currents, in my view, congealed into a formal Washington consensus on this side of the Atlantic, and to the inauguration of neoliberalism as a political and economic and ideological system. That system really begins to fall apart. And it begins to fall apart, quite frankly, from a little bit, I would argue, before 2008 and the major recession. But that when you look at the 2008 recession, you begin to see that the economic model can no longer doesn't hold. That really what you have is since 1980 in particular to the present moment, one of the greatest processes of inequality that we have seen in human societies. The way I like to put it is as the in questions of inequality is on speed dial. This is not just a gap between rich and poor. This is the way in which inequalities map itself through on every aspect of human life, in every domain of human life. And so that what you have then, I would want to argue, is that after 2008 and the recession, is that you begin to see the system begin to the cracks are now clear. Cracks were clear before, some of us would argue, but let's say 2008, the cracks become very, very clear. Certainly at the level of the economy, and as the cracks become clear, then you also begin to see that people themselves are beginning to question the actual ideological beliefs and foundations in which they had come to believe that the market could solve everything, that we are only just individuals, and so on, that there's no real society, all of that, and that equality and inequality was just a kind of par for the course. It's human nature. There's not much you can do. You can do about it. But as these things begin to happen, then I think something also begins to emerge. As crisis emerges, then there are two responses to crisis. There's a response, or there can be more than two, but two that we know about. There's one kind of response can be, okay, let us move towards a sign of collective society with solidarities and rethink who we are and so on, and different kind of society. But also another reaction is the old comebacks, and the old returns with a force that surprises us. In America, the old is mixed up, and all over the world, but I would argue in America, because this is where we're sitting, the old is mixed up with white supremacy. In other words, that, particularly when you had the election of Obama, many people thought, oh, okay, you don't have it, racism is gone. It was never gone. What I think Obama's election did was it actually catalyzed and galvanized the right within the crisis, because one of the foundational things about capitalism in America has to do with its racial nature and how it is related to what you said before, questions of race and therefore questions of slavery. So it therefore catalyzed the right, birthed the movement, the Tea Party, etc., etc. And then all of that, I think, then explodes into a certain kind of understanding of self and of politics and of community that really then becomes rooted in white supremacy. And white supremacy, as you know, then begins to take on all these particular forms, and then it begins to organize itself in American society. So you have that. And that, I would argue, it becomes a really very important current in the conjuncture. So the conjuncture is, if we kind of map it, we would see economic crisis, we would see breaks in the ideological configuration, we would see the resurgence of white supremacy as it hadn't died, but it was, the way I like to put it, it was like kind of, and it had even gone underground, and it wasn't even a closet. It was just kind of lying low. but its resurgence then begins to emerge amongst white sections of the population, and as people begin to try to understand their life and the ways in which their life has fundamentally shifted in many ways. But you also see the emergence, quite frankly, of what became known as the Black Lives Matters movement, and that, in my view, is what you then get is really the current, that a mass current that begins to think about the foundations of American society, and the foundations of American society born in racial slavery and in capitalism. And so when that Black Lives Matter movement begins to raise the questions not just of police abolition, or begins to raise the questions not just of police violence, but begins to think about this business of abolition and what does that mean now, then they are trying to think about a question that has long been part of the Black radical tradition, which is, what is it that constitutes freedom, and how can we think about freedom? Okay, so what do you have in this conjuncture? You have in the conjuncture a system in crisis, and everybody acknowledges that crisis. One element of that response to that crisis is the emergence of authoritarian populism, which is rooted in white supremacy in America, and I would argue is also rooted in white supremacy in other parts of the world, although it might take the form of anti-immigration policies and so on. But you also have the emergence of Black Lives Matter and progressive movements outside of Black Lives Matter. In formal Democratic Party politics is the emergence of AC, the support of Bernie Sanders, and so on. So you are getting all these things in the conjuncture. There is no final. One cannot predict what the final resolution of this is going to be. What we are seeing is a struggle, and people call it cultural wars, right? And that's a total misnomer. What we are seeing is a battle about how are we going to live on this planet. That's what we are actually seeing. And it is because the current that argues for Black Lives Matter, that argues for abolition, is a current that also pays attention to the questions of the ecology and what has happened to the environment and how it has been destroyed. Is a current that pays great attention to questions of gender and patriarchy. In fact, the movement has one of the distinctive things about the movement, how it's different from the 1960s and 70s, is the attention it pays to gender, patriarchy, and ecology in a way that the movements in the 1960s and early 70s did not. So that's a question, I would argue, not just about blackness, but it's about how we're going to live on this planet. Because if we don't deal with how we're going to live on this planet, then we're going to be in problem. The other current is a current that is white supremacist and authoritarian, that really doesn't care about whether or not we live on this planet, and has a whole set of arguments about about, that there's no climate change. It, has a whole set of arguments which I think are important to think about, because they are arguments that are rooted in a certain understanding of truth, and a certain understanding of truth as fantasy. And that therefore it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter if California's fires are there. It doesn't matter if a place gets hotter. It really doesn't matter, because in your head as a fantasy you have that this is a kind of program and a kind of sort of lies that other people are telling, right? And that's how fantasy works. So that what you get in the I think one feature of the crisis, certainly from the point of view of the right, is a certain what I call ideological fantasy that has happened around questions of politics and human life. And that I would want to argue something that we haven't quite had before, right? That we have had it, if it has been rooted in fascism, a certain kind of racism in Hitler, and rooted, I would argue, in colonialism and so on, and racial slavery and all of that. But the way it manifests itself today, at the heart is white supremacy, but it also touches other things. It also deals with so-called, the way it understands science, or doesn't understand science, the way it doesn't, the way in which the questions of, say, a simple thing like a vaccination, becomes a political issue, where in mass becomes a political. All of that, I think, points to a certain kind of ways in which beliefs have been transformed into fantasy. And that then becomes important, and that fantasy then, in my view, becomes one way for authoritarian populism, in my view, to begin to begin to mobilize people. Because that's the only way you can explain that an obvious loss of election, and 6-7 months after the election, people are still saying, no, the election was not lost. It has nothing to do with reality. It has to do with a certain fantasy that you construct, right? And I think that within one of the other things about the conjuncture is that within an age of social media and the way in which technology works, particularly social media and technology, is that then all of this is put on what I call speed dial. Everything is exaggerated. Everything is speeded up. Everything has, if fascism works on the big lie, this is like the big lie plus to the x degree. Right, to the nth degree, that then makes people believe and act in a certain way, so that so that we are in this conjuncture, and if we Stuart draws the word conjuncture from Gramsci, but through reading Gramsci at this moment, I think we're also into an interregnum. That is, we are into a moment when there is no one force is actually dominant, right? And you're not sure what the balance of forces are, how the balance of forces are going to play out in the end. You are therefore in a most dangerous period. Okay? And what I think is important is for those of us who are on the left, and I use the word as in a capacious way, have to begin to think through the questions of white supremacy, the questions of the ecology and so on, but also have to, and gender, but also have to think on patriarchy, but also have to think through very carefully what are the kind of political tactics one needs to engage in at this moment to deal with what is this really dangerous situation, because none of us is God, and therefore none of us can predict what is likely to happen. But what you can be sure of is that you have these currents, and that these currents are actually jostling for power and jostling for dominance. And within the United States, if you come back to the U.S., it's the discussions and debate around critical theory were not discussions and debates around critical theory and around what should be taught in high schools. There were discussions and debates around who should dominate, what ideas should dominate in this space at this point in time. And so that what the point I'm making is that certainly for the folks who are on the right, the battle is an economic battle, but it is also a battle, an ideological battle. Right? And in this America, the question of the ideological battle, I would want to argue, is one of the most important ones. Because within the realm of ideology, in a society that is very much constructed around spectacle, that's constructed around media, where words like brand and influencer and so on are key words, where the market is not just economics, but the market is seen as yourself and relationship to consumption. All those kind of things, in my view, means that the question of ideas is actually really very, very important. And so, so we are in my view, it's a long answer, but we're in my view into an interregnum. Mm-hmm. We're in the interregnum with the balance of forces are not yet settled. Mm-hmm. There's no social settlement at all that will, and I don't see it in the near future.
Yeah, Gramsci says in the interregnum, a variety of morbid symptoms appear.
Absolutely.
And part of those morbid symptoms, as you describe, are, Fox News, the kind of hysteria produced around anti-vax and the rest of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, and it's in this moment that's so unpredictable, as you say, the kind of resolutions of the crisis, as Hall might say, they're not determined in advance. Mm-hmm. They're a product of a political struggle as much as anything else. And, your work has long grappled with what you term radical political intellectuals. And so I want to turn, to a discussion of one C.L.R. James. Your book, Caliban's Freedom, the Early Political Thought of C.L.R. James, in 2022, it'll be the 25th anniversary of that book. And of course, as viewers will no doubt be familiar with, in that work, you're looking at James's writings from the 30s until the early 1950s, when he's deported from the United States in this Cold War hysteria. And in that way, you turn our attention to the centrality of his theories of race and class, of the independent vitality of the Black liberation struggle, and also of his theory of direct democracy. He famously says every cook can govern, something he takes from Lenin, I believe. And he extends that conception of politics as every cook can govern. I mean, it resonates with Gramsci there too. We're all intellectuals. To talk about how the masses in motion throw up their own visions of freedom and of democracy. And he wants to take that seriously, as do you. How did you come to this project?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things, or several things. First is that I think C.L.R. James decides to leave in 52 because what the immigration folks say to him, if you leave, you may be able to come back sometime. If we deport you, there ain't no way you can come back. So he takes the decision to leave, and I think that's important because in '68 when he comes back, how people at Howard University, at Federal City College and Howard University invite him back and find a way to get him back. It is because he was able to leave he took the decision to leave. Now, how did I come to James? This is. I'm born in the Caribbean, in Jamaica. I am a high school student activist. From I was 15, 16, and in high school I was involved in marches, etc., etc. I am before I enter university, I am very moved and influenced by what's happening in the United States, the civil rights movement. We hear about it and so on. I'm growing up in a neo-colony, majority black country, but in which of former British colony, but in which the economic structures are still colonial and are owned by white and folks, and where the social structures is very much still based on old colonial racial plantation structures. And so, as I grow up in this particular period, I am being drawn into radical politics and so on, particularly through Black Power and through the American Civil Rights Movement. By the time I reached university in the 70s, I am again involved in student politics there, undergraduate. But I meet somebody by the name of Richard Small, who was James's secretary, in a good sense, of when Richard was studying in London. And we are in this group together, and I'm the Abeng group. I'm the youngest member of the Abeng group. I'm there with all these people, lawyers and professors and so on. And I'm a high school student and just about to go to university. And he gives me Facing Reality to read. And I read Facing Reality and I am blown away, essentially. And that's the first book of James I read. Not Black Jacobins, not anything else, and I just Facing Reality. And that book becomes perhaps the most important signature work of James to me. Not just because it's the first one, but because in it's a description of workers' councils. You know what it is. It's about Hungary and the 1956 revolution in Hungary and this, the workers' councils. And it's written with him, Grace Lee, and Castrodes, the fellow from Socialism and Barbarism in Paris. And so my first introduction, coming from a middle class family, to C.L.R. James is around direct democracy, if you want to put it that way. And so I am the business of not having a political party. Right? Now, I changed my view about a political party because I'm in the Caribbean, and I make a decision by the time I'm in my 20s that we need that James' notion of the political party is good for America and so on. But for those of us who are in the third world, there's the need for a political party. But it's not a Leninist party, it's a mass political party. Okay? What he himself calls in his book on Caribbean politics, published in 1961, after he leaves the PNM in Trinidad, the Mass Democratic Party. Okay. So that, therefore, I become very preoccupied with James, and I read backwards. In other words, I read Facing Reality, and then I read Notes on Dialectics. I mean, I'm reading backwards, and then I finally come to Black Jacobins. Okay, so my reading of James is both is political and philosophical. Then Black Jacobins, then Minty Alley, then his short stories, right? So you begin to you see, right? And I'm following that reading independently of any other thing I'm doing at the university. Not really preoccupied with the university. I'm preoccupied with reading and with politics and trying to understand the society in which I live in. And everything James mentions, I follow. So he mentions Hegel, I read more Hegel. If he mentions Marx, I read Marx. If he mentions Lenin, I read Lenin. If he mentions Trotsky, I read Trotsky. I mean, that's so. That's the kind of reading I'm doing. And then I'm obviously in, as students, we have Marxist study groups, so we study Marx, and, we do Capital, and we do economic philosophical manuscripts, and German ideology, and so on. But at the center of all of that is James, for me, as a political figure, as a thinker, but as also someone who was involved in practical politics, who was not an academic. And so therefore, my attraction to James is also attraction to a certain style. In other words, that you are not an academic. That the academy, as Stuart says, becomes a place where you can do certain things, but to be an academic means that you follow the protocols of the academy. My reading that I have just said to you is not a reading that follows the protocols of the academy. My reading is about following a certain set of questions in order to understand a certain politics and to understand the society and the culture in which I live in. Because I'm also very interested in literature, like James. I'm trying to actually study history, philosophy, and literature. That's what I'm thinking about. I don't like to study politics because I think politics I think political science is a subject that guts actual politics itself in the way I understand politics, which we can talk about. So that, therefore, when I dropped out of undergraduate to deciding that I did not really want to spend time anymore in the University of the West Indies, and then went to live in the sugar estate, in one of the poorest sugar estates and sugar parishes of the country, to live among sugar workers, to organize a trade union. I was doing what I thought, what I understood James said that we should be doing. And so I became an organizer. And worked with what was called the Sugar Workers Cooperative Council, which was to organize sugar workers to take over the estates that their great-great-grandfathers who were slaves and mothers had worked on. That was a policy moment or a policy issue, program of the 1970s Michael Manley government. And in my 20s, myself and lots of other young people went to do other things. We left university because we thought it was important to do certain things to make change in Jamaica. And I went to live in the sugar belt, Westmoreland, a place called Townhead, to organize sugar workers. And I learned from them. I come from a middle-class family. So I've never mixed up with sugar workers, the poorest of the poor, and people who lived in housing and under economic and social conditions of the late 19th century. So living in, close to those conditions, spending time with them, taught me a lot about Jamaican working class that I could never learn in a sociology or a politics class in the University of the West Indies. When I then got the idea in my head that I should really be a writer. So you can see the influence of James. You don't have to go to university for this. I can be a writer. And so I began to write and spent a lot of time writing as articles, particularly on music, because I was also a musician at that time. And so it was about, therefore, being this radical writer. And working with the working class and the kind of Jamesian kind of model, if you want to use that word. I then become a journalist. We are partially successful in getting the land for the sugar workers, not the factories. We get the land for them, but we don't get the factories. I begin to work as a journalist, and I can't keep a job because I'm too left. I have a perspective. I organize unions. Whenever I go, I land in a place. My first thing is, okay, who's the union? Where's the union? And so on. And so I lose my jobs very quickly, and therefore, don't work, can't find work, and That's not a problem, because if you're left to use, my view was that you suffer the consequences. You don't expect people to say to you, okay, welcome, young man, you oppose us. Here's a job for you while you oppose us. Eh? So, that's how life is. But I'm saying this because you're asking about James, so it's a journey before I come back to this. I'm married to my first wife, who's South African and who has her own radical background. We are both in, she loses her job at the University of the West Indies. She just graduated, in part because they weren't treating her right, but also in part because she was, there are images of her in the front newspapers of her holding our child in a pram as the workers shut down the university. She was at the front gate. So when our contract came up for renewal, she had other difficulties with them, and so I think it was okay. And so that we were both in a position in our 20s, early 20s, of not having an economic foundation, quite frankly, not knowing where to finding money to pay the rent. And we had a child. And her parents, who were Trotskyists from South Africa and who had been in exile, had been put in exile by the government, apartheid government, lived in London. And when she wrote them to tell them our position, they didn't ask any question, they just sent us 2 tickets. And we went to London. And that's how I got to London. In London, I continued to do political work and journalistic work, working part-time for the BBC, but also founding and editing a paper called Flame, Black Workers' paper. And then doing a lot of work on anti-fascist work. So if you read the books that have been written about the anti-fascist movement in the 1970s, late 70s, you will see that my name comes up often as someone who led demonstrations and was secretary of things and so on. But in all of that, and if you look at the very first pamphlet I write, which Flame publishes, which is called Black Nationalism and Socialism, you will actually see there an essay with James about the Negro problem. And it's not that one, there's a one right before that.
Okay.
And that's because that tells you, it's my preoccupation with James. James is I'm thinking with James, but I'm not just thinking with James, I'm acting with James. Because I'm thinking, because for me, the questions of politics is not just about thinking, it's about acting. For me, the questions of words and deeds in politics are very closely related. And it's important because later on I begin to think about the question of notion of practice and practice and its relation and practice as a certain kind of theoretical formulation. And so, that pamphlet, which is called Black Nationalism and Socialism, comes out of my editorship of the Flame newspaper, which is called Flame, a Black Workers' newspaper. And then, a couple of years after we've been in London, we returned to Jamaica. We returned to Jamaica. The university asked her to come back. She gets a job. She begins to run the graduate program, and then I get a job after a while in the JBC.
What was her name?
Her Jacqueline Landman, right? I spent time at JBC up until 1980, and then the elections happened of 1980, in which the United States intervenes, destabilizes the country. The government loses the election, and I am myself and Brian Meeks and John Maxwell are the first casualties because the Conservatives, the Jamaican Labour Party, made it clear in their campaign that I would never work again in Jamaica because I was a communist. And so they fired us. Brian, myself, and John. John is my past. And Brian is more my colleague here, yeah. It was at that moment I was asked to come and work with the People's National Party by D.K. Duncan, who's now dead, just passed because of COVID 1 year now, and Beverly Manley, and to help build what they call the Mass Democratic Party. And I'm doing all of that. I'm thinking, because you asked about James, I'm doing all of that because James is in my head, if you want to put it as simple as that. James is the person that I'm thinking about, and the way in which, if you're thinking about politics, how you build a mass democratic party. And so I do that. And then when that period finishes, so as not to bore your audience, I decide to go back to school. And when I go back to school to do a PhD, then obviously, what would I work on? I could only work on James. There was nothing else for me to. Work on, and so the question of trying to think about James was, one could do a dissertation about James and in one's life, but that wasn't the point. The point was how could one think about the political thought of James? And in trying to do that, I had read Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, which was just extraordinary for me, quite frankly. That would have been about in 1990. Just really extraordinary. And in this very same way that James's Facing Reality was like an extraordinary opening for me. In the same way that Du Bois's Black Reconstruction was also an opening. Cedric's Black Marxism was an opening. And I therefore began to think through that, okay, James was a member of the Black radical tradition. And that in fact, those of us who were just straight Marxists had actually gotten some things not quite right. And that you must also then remember I had spent some time in London where I was involved in black struggles. So that therefore, what you're thinking about is that I'm in a neo-colonial country, moving amongst black workers. I go to England, I form a black workers paper. I come back to the academy to do my PhD. Naturally, I'm now going to be thinking about not just Marxism, but I'm also going to be thinking about the relationship of black struggles to Marxism. And so that's what I begin to. That's when I think. I begin to have a different kind of way to begin to think about black intellectual struggles and ideology, as well as politics, and to begin to think through this question of the black radical intellectual tradition and what it means. So James is the opening for this. But James is also, as you know, a paradoxical opening, because James is a product of the British colonial system and of the West, Western intellectual tradition in many ways. But he's also deeply committed to this and understands, quite frankly, the way the independent movement to black struggles, particularly in this country, which I've just written about in another essay published in African American Political Thought. But that independent understanding, in my view, comes from his understanding of the question of the issue about self-emancipation of the masses of the people themselves. Okay, all right. So that's that. There's another part of what you said, though, which I think is important for us to think about, and that is the difficulty in United States is the ways in which the structures of white supremacy work. and what I've come to call this fantasy. So that the white working class, and Du Bois makes this clear, because of the wages of whiteness, and way in which white supremacy then creates this sense of, fantasy of racial supremacy and so on, means that the actions of that class itself oftentimes become not radical actions that can liberate itself or form itself in alliance with others. That oftentimes that class finds itself entrapped in a certain kind of racial order that has been created, and so that the racial order becomes both the touchstone but also the fallback position when things don't seem to be going right, when you can't seem to understand what is in front of you. And so that therefore even James's understanding that about the self activity of the working class within the American context, you have to go back to Du Bois. You have to think about that self activity in fact becomes blunted and do what Linton Kwesi Johnson would call a kind of rebellion that runs down the wrong road. Right? Runs down the wrong road because of the racial order and the racial way in which capitalism operates in this country. That does not mean that one then says, okay, let's give up on this business. In my view, what it means is that you are into a unique kind of struggle that neither Lenin nor Marx nor James or anybody else, in my view, can talk to you about. That it is something that you have to begin to think through out for yourself about how, in fact, what are the forms of struggles that you need to have in this country that can move people towards self-emancipation. In that context, I think it is important to say that given the structures of racial capitalism and its history, and that it is actually the touchstone for those struggles, for democratic struggles, the touchstone for new forms of life, that touchstone is actually the struggle of black people. And it is because of what Du Bois calls the second sight in souls of black folks. The ability to see, even if you are at the top of the social order, like say a President Obama, you're on top of that social order, but you're black. And I don't agree with a lot of things about President Obama. President Obama was the president of an empire. And the logic of empire, in my view, means he did certain things. But the fact of him being black was a catalyst for certain galvanizing of white supremacy and of racism, anti-black racism. And so that therefore, to me, it is now what you're looking at is not whether race or class is which one is more important, which is a kind of mechanistic old view of trying to think about these things, or even to think about the kind of intersectionality of these things. What you are looking at is the way in which all these things of race and class and gender and so on are totally interspersed with each other. And to use that old phrase that comes out of Hegel, interpenetration with each other. That they work with each other, and that they work with each other at the level both not just of the economic, but very importantly in America, they work at the level of the symbolic, at the level of ideas of what it is that we believe and how is it we can act, and so that therefore what it's important is then to think through how different America is in trying to think about what kind of political and social struggles that we need to engage in. And what the only thing, therefore, that James, I think, tells us, or certainly tells me, is, and he and Stuart, I think, are important for this, is a certain attention to the concrete, a certain understanding always of the concrete, of understanding not the things in abstract, but the things in concrete. So when you say things in motion, that's what I understand. I understand the concrete to be things in motion. Yes. All right? And okay, how do you grapple with things in motion? How do you theorize about it if you have to? But very importantly, how do you intervene in with things in motion?
Well, as you were just saying, Tony, really Caliban's freedom was a product of multiple conversations. As a labor activist, as a journalist, as a scholar at the University of West Indies, and you come to the importance of James's theory of direct democracy and how it influenced your conception of politics. In this dramatic period. In 1980, you republish one of James's really important essays on the revolutionary answer to the black problem, termed something else, but updated. In 1948, he had initially published this alongside two essays of your own. And, James's essay and your work elaborating his conception of politics, as we've discussed, really emphasize democratic self-activity, but also the independence of the Black liberation struggle. And I think this speaks to what you were emphasizing before. The dynamics of race and class led to this situation where there was a necessity of an independent Black freedom struggle. And, so I wanted to ask you about the vision there, because I think, that uprising in Liberty City and Miami in 1980, James's work resonated then, but it continues to resonate now. Here we are, 7 years out after the historic rebellion in Ferguson following the murder of Mike Brown. We've seen masses move in Baltimore and New York, more recently in the summer of 2020 with the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor protest, and we have memories of that are ongoing, obviously, because there's the trial of the vigilante murder of Ahmaud Arbery. But James's work continues to speak in this turbulent moment. So, you've spoken about how you invoke James's lessons in this earlier moment. What are James's lessons for our own? How does his writings help us?
Yeah, I think, Jordan, that is the pamphlet which you have there is, Marxism and Black Liberation, is actually written because I was in London, one, because I was also in discussions with groups here, and I was living in Jamaica. And 1980 was the elections and destabilization by U.S. imperialism of the Democratic Socialist government and Michael Manley. So I am reporting on that, and as a journalist, but I'm also thinking about Black struggles in the United States. And I think it's important because you want to come back to my early formation in terms of politics, the ways in which Black struggles in this country and in Africa, but both here and in Africa, have shaped my early high school radicalism. And so for me, Liberty City, which I wasn't here when it happened, but I read it very carefully, particularly through the Miami Herald, and then also speaking to people who lived there, meant I could think about in some way, not in the ways I would like to, but I could think about some ways about the questions of independent black struggle. And that this text was around that to emphasize, really to take the James argument a little further for 1980s. Okay, in this present moment, in the post Ferguson, post the massive marches and demonstrations around Black Lives Matter, what is the relevance of CLR? The relevance of CLR is not so much the independence of the black struggle. I think the actual black African American black movement in motion has demonstrated that. You don't need to see that. You don't need to argue that. But there is a method about James's political work that I think is important. And it has to do, because I come from the Caribbean, the analogy I use is the game of cricket. In the game of cricket, which is a game of bat and ball, similar to baseball in some ways, but fundamentally different, the key, if you're a batsman, is that, or a fielder or a wicket keeper, that is, you keep him behind the stumps, or if you're a fielder out in the outfield, is that you have to keep your eye on the ball. You cannot not keep your eye on the ball. If you're a batsman and you don't keep your eye on the ball, particularly if the ball is coming at 96 miles an hour, it's going to damage you, okay? And so, metaphorically, what does it mean to keep one's eye on the ball? It means, practically, speaking metaphorically about keeping an eye on the ball, but what does it mean practically? It means paying attention to the slightest details, to details which don't seem to matter. Not just the details of politics writ large, or politics with a small p, but to pay attention to people's lives in the daily way. What it is they do, what is it they say, what kind of cultural things do they practice, what are their songs, etc. Those things of just paying attention to detail, in my view, as a radical intellectual, allows you to understand the moment as to what is happening. Not from your own, not from theory, but from a way in which you can, from a method that says pay attention to what you see before you. The incident I always use is the incident that James himself quote about Lenin, which is that Lenin is in hiding. The revolution has happened, or is happening, but he has gone into hiding. And he is in a peasant's house somewhere. And she's offering him bread, and he's being very kind to say, no, I know you don't have enough, so please don't offer me any. And she says, no, we have enough, but they dare not take it away from us. And he then begins to think about switching the slogans of the Bolshevik Party to include bread. Right? So that's an attention to details. So, he's a radical intellectual. He's a Bolshevik. Bread is not a particular concern. But for this ordinary peasant woman who doesn't even know who he is, to offer him bread and for her to respond like that means that he's keeping his eye on the ball. And it is this business, and James quotes that story hundreds of times, so it's this business of keeping one eye on the ball. What is it that people are doing? What are the people are saying? What are they doing in their churches? What are they doing in their music, etc.? All those things, in my view, becomes important. And so it is this what I would want to suggest is important for us, the method. Because the method then allows us to understand the balance of forces. So you keep your eye on the ball about what the masses and the ordinary people, everyday people are doing, but you also keep your eye on the ball about what the bourgeoisie, what the rich is doing, what the elites are doing. Right? You have to keep, you have to keep both of those. You have to be two-sided. trying to understand these things. So it's the method I want. And for me, I think that in thinking about radical politics and theory in particular, it is the answers that people give to questions are important, but they are not as important as the questions that are asked and the method that they get to the questions. Because the questions, not that the questions shift, but the moments shift. And therefore, if you're looking at the moment with an old set of answers, you're going to run into trouble. You're not going to understand what is happening before you. And you'll be writing and so on and all that sort of thing. And that's fine. You write and publish. I mean, one of the things I notice is that people can always write and publish. That's fine. But if you don't want to just have an echo chamber, that is you writing to you and your friends, but you want to write as a way in which I think writing for radical writing must do, for intellectual radical writing is about, which is about interventions. If you want to have to be able to make an intervention, then that intervention has to be based on a method that allows you to pay attention to the details. In other words, it is the concrete that lives. It is not that theory lives. It's the concrete that lives. And because the concrete lives, then we are able to theorize about it. But it is the concrete that lives.
I really appreciate that focus on the concrete and also on the public interventions, that James stages in his method of analysis. Donald Pease, in his introduction to James's Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, a new edition, he argues that James provides a possible model of what he calls a transnational Americas, not American, but Americas study, and that would no longer simply center the United States. And I find this compelling in relationship to what you're saying about James's method, his research design, and his vision. And I would also say that James provides a model, therefore, of the public humanities. And I know you've been doing a lot of work in this direction, to move the scholarly writing and discussion away from simply the classroom or the conference circuit or academic publishing, particularly what you do here with the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. So I wonder if you could talk about how James fits within your own vision of the field of public humanities,
I mean, he's responsible. He's responsible because I operate from the position that I have learned, which is about paying attention to the concrete, but also, very importantly, find ways in which you connect all the time and intervene with everyday people. And so that, therefore, I, over, a couple of years, I've come to think that one of the ways that people, ordinary people, everyday people, learn their history at school, high school, etc., but that they learn new histories or old histories are reinforced through museums and exhibitions. That, people would come and say, but they saw this in this particular exhibition where it said this, this, and this. And therefore, if the academy becomes the kind of site of authoritative knowledge for bourgeois society, for scholars and for students, then the museum becomes the authoritative site, knowledge site for everyday people, And it's not that everybody goes to the museum, please. But people take their families and it's an outing and so on and so forth. And so I began to think, okay, where is it? What's the venue that we can begin to work that would open up a different terrain for people to understand questions of racial slavery, questions of colonialism, not as historical terms and configurations of societies, but as social systems which have legacies, the ways in which what I call how history travels as sedimented deposits. And in those sediment deposits, it readapts and adapts itself. Or all issues readapt and rearrange themselves in the present moment. And I mean, a perfect example of the sedimented deposit is the way in which anti-black racism and white supremacy becomes the dominant again. Not that it wasn't dominant, but the virulence in which it appears in the present moment is the way in which a certain kind of way in which history works and travels as sediment deposit, particularly if the question of the old is not resolved. Then it reappears and comes back and grabs you by the throat. And so that I therefore felt that it was that the question of public humanities, which includes public history, was an important way, important method to begin to engage publics. And so everything we do at the center has two legs. One leg is the scholarly leg, where we engage scholars like yourself and others, and we do projects around various things that are purely scholarly and has a scholarly output. But that the second leg is a leg in which we engage, we find ways to engage publics, to bring people in, to have people talk to us. One of the things we produce, and again, this is all because of, really our faith in reality in many ways, is that we produced a teacher resource on the history of racial slavery in Americas. The normal way to do that would be to put together a group of us as scholars, historians, and to say, okay, what do we need to write? And we write it. We proceeded rather from the other way. We brought the students in first. And we said, what is it you think you need to know? And then they told us. And then we brought the teachers in, and then we said, okay, what do you as a teacher think you need to know and how you need to teach this? And we had the scholars in the room. And then we said to the scholars, okay, right. And then when we finished writing, we went it back to the students and to the teachers and said, okay, how does this meet your expectations? Does this look like something you would want to work with? Now that process takes much longer, but the success of the module, which is both a teacher resource as well as a student manual, is rooted in the method that we have followed. Secondly, that in trying to think through what it is, how we think about exhibitions, we have developed a project with the National African History Museum and with 7 other museums in the world. And the part of the project is about a traveling exhibition.
This is the global curatorial
project. But we said to ourselves, again, and this is James speaking in my head, the history of slavery can be told by a group of curators, international curators, some of the most brilliant ones in the world. And we can all meet for 2 years and decide what objects, what the theme should be. What happened if we flip the switch a bit and begin to do work simultaneously with the descendants of communities in the world who were enslaved in Africa, in the Caribbean, in North America, in Brazil, and some of their descendants in Europe? To begin to have a series of conversations with them first about what such an exhibition should look like, A, and B, to also begin to talk to them to see, are there people, particularly in continental Africa, are there folks who have a memory of a set of stories that are told to them that needs to find its place in such an exhibition? So you see how we are working, and we're doing them simultaneously. And it's so that it is a transformation of curatorial practice as well. We call the conversations that we have had in Senegal, which we have just worked out with our colleagues how to do it in Brazil. We're a little late because of COVID, and we were kind of trying to wait for that moment when we could do it without putting people in danger with public health and COVID. We have worked out this morning with our colleagues in Cape Town, because that fine wine that we all love, Pinotage and so on, that comes from the Western Cape, was produced first by slaves. And the conditions of those wine farms in Stellenbosch and in parts of the Western Cape are not far removed from the 19th century slave conditions. And so we have worked out that, and then we're trying to work through Caribbean, Guadeloupe, and Martinique, what it is, how we can do that. We are working out, and we worked out in Liverpool. We call it what? Unfinished Conversation, Stuart Hall. Okay? So the point is always, how do you get the ways in which everyday people think, feel, and understand? How do you make that part of what it is that you are doing? And such a method also transforms history itself. So I'll give you one concrete example. Before going to Senegal to do this work, I spent a lot of time, I know a bit about African history, but I spent a lot of time immersing myself in Senegalese history, the best books. When I go to my group, the group that I'm with, and working with the colleagues from the University of Dakar, when we go to these villages in the north, where not many people from town go, the city of Dakar go to, and we began to interview persons that they had identified, we suddenly begin to find that they are telling us a set of histories where even the scholars who are writing do not know. And so that therefore what you are getting is a much richer and complex stories. And particularly, quite frankly, in the Senegalese case, of women and therefore of gender. And in a country that is Muslim. So that this kind of method of working is a method that allows us to complicate pop history, to do different versions of history, and to curate an exhibition that will allow for, in that exhibition, the voices of descendants of slaves telling their own particular story. That to me is a different kind of way of thinking about historical knowledge, of trying to find a way in which how the history is present in the now, as people tell a particular story about themselves and their ancestors and how they got there, and how when a woman in a village says, "This village was set up by my great-great-grandmother because she did this. She was fleeing this. She was fleeing the French. She was doing this," and so on. And she's saying all of this, and you go to another village and they tell you a similar story, then you begin to say to yourself, okay, perhaps one conception of freedom that people were thinking about was movement and migration. I don't like what is happening here. They are treating me in a certain way here. I'm going to pack up and go. And then you think to yourself, okay, on this side of the Atlantic, what was one of the most immediate forms of people searching for freedom? Marriage. You treat us badly. We are enslaved. The black bodies is being treated with violence. There's power in the flesh. Slavery generates violence. I mean, everything that we know. I'm packing up and I'm going. I'm running away to another place. And so the idea, therefore, of us thinking on this part of the world that marronage is only when what happens in the hills of Jamaica or in the swamps of the south in this country or in Palmares and Brazil. Perhaps there's a kind of way in which people who are enslaved from 1400, from 1500 onwards are thinking about, and where there's space, because if there's no space, you can't do this. In Barbados, there was no space. But if there's space, how can we actually construct various forms of marronage outside of this particular system?
Now that's a vision of the public humanities that I think can really shape the work that my colleagues and certainly our viewers will be eager to learn from, and we'll follow the Global Curatorial Project. I know it'll be over the next several years with great interest. I wanted to follow up with a question about gender and about feminism, because you also write about Ida B. Wells Barnett's writing, and particularly about how her interventions about lynching, about racial terror, and about racial capitalism defined an international public conversation in that period. And of course, her work has been revived in our own moment. There's been a kind of public recovery of this work. We've seen the New York Times has recently written an obituary as a part of a series of neglected figures, acknowledging that they had overlooked her work and life. Last year, in places like Nashville, we saw protesters reclaim her work and name a plaza, Ida B. Wells Plaza. So, I wanted to ask you this, what does it mean to reclaim her work in the Black radical intellectual tradition that, as Cedric Robinson describes, wasn't meant to exhaust the subject, but rather to recognize it was there. Mm-hmm. He said that was his task. And you take this seriously, and you take up this challenge to argue that Wells Barnett represents a stream of this tradition where political and cultural activity merge into a Black feminist praxis. Mm-hmm. So can you reflect on her work for this moment?
Yeah, I think that a couple of things. Firstly, it is always good when not always good, but it is I always note with a certain sense of sly amusement that when the elite presses take up a particular figure, because I also become worried, quite frankly. Because when a figure gets taken up, he or she then quickly becomes gutted of the radicalism that he or she has. And for me, that processes most compellingly and remarkably done, because that's all you can say, with King. So King becomes only I have a dream. You got the King who talks about the poor, who was anti-war, who was anti-capitalist. You got that, and all you get is a postage stamp King, right? And this is one thing that that's why this is one of the things that I think is really important to understand about American society and the elite and its capacity to what I call capture, gut, and spit back out in a different way figures and what figures represent. So I acknowledge and with a wry smile, and then I wait for the gutting to happen. Okay. But I think that Ida B. Wells is important because of the following reasons. She's not just a journalist in the way in which the Times has said, doing some obituary for people they think they have missed. She is primarily a writer who is practicing a certain form of journalism that is available to her as a political practice of intervention against anti-black racism and lynching at a moment in American history. That's what she's doing. She is supremely a political figure. But we have, because she's writing for these newspapers and so on and all these articles, but we say that's what she is. But she is a political figure who's using the newspapers as a method, as a political method to draw attention to something that's wrong, fundamentally wrong in American society. So therefore, I think that what is important when I think about Wells is that she's this interventionist political figure, one. That secondly, by the time she gets to Chicago, as we know, she's involved in a sort of, she's a feminist, but her feminism is very much related to the black community that's there. And that she's a feminist and she's a person who troubles the waters to the extent that even black radical figures cannot, quite frankly, deal with her. So Du Bois will find her difficult and prickly. And I think when you hear a radical figure say something about a female, not a female radical, that this person is prickly. Beware, because what is saying is that this person, this woman is not standing up for foolishness, and she is not going to, she will speak her mind. And therefore she will break the mold of even what radical men expect women supposed to be. Right? So in other words, there's a certain patriarchy that is operating there. And then she will recognize it. And her business of speaking for her mind is in fact about breaking that kind of patriarchy that exists. So that to me is what you're looking at. So you're looking at a figure who is practicing, who is a political intellectual, radical political intellectual, who's taken on what is, horrific acts of racial violence, that is lynching, who is organizing and talking about it in a way that nobody else is, but who's also, quite frankly, taken on patriarchy that exists amongst even radical men. And so for me, she is just one of the most remarkable figures, I think, within the Black radical tradition. And I wish we would pay attention to her not just as this journalist, but as this political figure who finds this way of intervening and where writing becomes important as form of intervention. Because what I would also want to argue is that her writing as an intervention, as a form of political intervention, transforms the actual practices of writing itself. And that those are things, as if you're scholars, that those are things, in my view, you would want to pay attention to. And so, I mean, I am glad for the plaza. I'm glad when I read it in the New York Times, I said, okay. But we just need to pay. The Black radical tradition tells us that somebody like her is much more than what I think we popularly might want her to be. And let me just say it, because there's a drive that I think is important, which is a drive of necessity. But it is also a drive that can land you outside of where you want to go. As Black folks, we are happy for recognition because the system, which is founded on Black folks being non-human, and are not therefore seen within the systems of representation, as Stuart would want to think about it, what I would call a kind of systems of symbolic order, the imaginaries which constitute the society. And so that there's always a drive to see, okay, how can we, as Black folks, be represented in this imaginary, in this symbolic order, which is constitutive of the society in which we live in. But you have to see yourself that one of the ways in which the system works is that it allows for representation, but it allows for representation on its own terms. And in allowing for representation on its own terms, and it comes back to this point of gutting. So I go to the post office to buy stamps. I'm a little old-fashioned. I like to buy stamps and put my things in the mail. I send email like everybody else on WhatsApp and so on. But I like sometimes to write a letter and, a card and put it in the mail. And so I go and always say, okay, what is the Black history thing that you have? Is it Frederick Douglass? Is it who? And so on. Marvin Gaye and so on, and. But I also know that what I'm doing is that I like the representation, but that representation does not mean that the questions about racial domination and racial oppression are settled. They're not settled. But we are also symbolic beings. And as symbolic beings, we also work with representations. And I think that one of the tremendous capacities of the American system is this capacity for representation. This is why Hollywood is Hollywood.
Yeah. Sure. No, it's one of the challenges that you put forward in Black Heretics, Black Prophets, to really think of, Ida B. Wells and others as political intellectuals, right? Who, as you suggest, are, intervening in particular debates, and so they can't be reduced simply to kind of symbol, or even though there are massive efforts, this is what hegemony looks like, to incorporate elements of its opposition. And so I take you to be offering a kind of caution there. I think there's lessons from some of the other political intellectuals in this direction. I mean, after all, another Black radical political intellectual that you focus on in Black Heretics, Black Prophets, as well as elsewhere, is Walter Rodney. And he was trying to deal with the situation of independence, the post-colony, right? And how to build alliances when these regimes had incorporated elements of dissent and a language that looked progressive, a certain kind of representation, but the material reality was grim, And of course, Rodney, as a historian, saw his work as a scholar, but he, our listeners might know that he was excluded from his position in Guyana. And a lot of his work was to build alliances among the working people and to address the racial and ethnic divisions that festered under Forbes Burnham's regime. He was arrested multiple times. In his last book that was posthumously published, he actually makes the final edits as lambing notes in the introduction from a cell, And of course, Rodney was assassinated. He was killed. Last year marked the 40th anniversary of that dramatic event. But you clarify how Rodney saw, like James, popular struggles from below as the basis for a political praxis in the post-colony, and argue, I think, that he exposed the political crisis of the state in which state power had been delegitimized in the eyes of the masses of people and generated widespread social protest. And we can see that this is a crisis that in some ways persists in the region. And so I wanted to ask you, how can Rodney's writings as a political intellectual continue to aid us in understanding, protest in the region?
Walter, in my view, represents one of the finest contemporary late 20th century radical political intellectuals. Comes out of the Caribbean. He's not just preoccupied with the Caribbean, he's preoccupied with Africa, as you know. His book, How Europe Underdevelops Africa, is a remarkable text. He's also very preoccupied with African-American struggle. Some of his best speeches were given in Atlanta at the Institute of Black World, where he was, he passed through many times along with other radical intellectuals, Caribbean intellectuals. And so Rodney represents a figure from the Caribbean that was, in my view, practiced a certain kind of radical Black internationalism in a much stronger way than CLR did. And the way I like to think of some of the work I do is that I'm walking in those footsteps. In fact, truth to be told, is that when I was going to do my PhD, I wanted to do Walter, and somebody whispered to me, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Somebody else in the class is about to do that. And I thought, okay, let me go back to James, who I had originally thought, but you're trying to think about who you should do as you think through your dissertation. But I think that Walter brings something new, which I think is important. One, he brings the concept of what he calls groundings, which comes out of a popular Rastafari lexicon. And for him, groundings is what I was talking to you about. Groundings is the ability for the radical intellectual not to come and preach, but to actually come and listen and learn. And not that he or she doesn't have anything to say, that's please. But that if you are radical, you are trying to think about the transformation of society, then you have to be thinking about what do the ordinary, everyday people in that society think about in that society. And so you have to listen carefully. And as Walter says, he learned from the Rastafari. So he brings to political practice, this is why I think deeds are important. He brings to political practice this idea of groundings, this idea of listening, right? Which we try and talk about in the unfinished conversations, of listening to people and finding a way, therefore, of getting people's ideas included in whatever project that you are involved in, and you are giving it back to them, because we have developed all sorts of protocols to give it back to people today, this morning we were talking about South Africans, how in fact once the project is finished, how it must not finish, because we must allow the farm workers to interview each other to continue to develop their own stories, even without this project being present. So that the idea, therefore, of groundings is I think something he brings to the table. The other thing that he brings to the table, which I think is important, is his attempt to what he himself calls Caribbeanized Marxism, which is to take Marxism, but to then think about Marxism, and this is why I come back to what I said, the concrete. So here we are in the Caribbean. Here is where I live. Here is going to my political terrain. How do I understand the Caribbean? And therefore, if I'm a Marxist, how do I Caribbeanize Marxism to make it relevant, to make it alive in this region that I'm living? And out of that effort comes something which is very important, which Walter talks about a lot, which is that you don't play around with democracy. That democracy is not just this bourgeois thing. That you have to think about that the rights that people have now are fundamental, and that you can't think about a society post the revolution where those rights don't exist for these people. Which means what? You have to think about forms post the revolution of a different kind of society that does not essentially circle around what some people would call a dictatorship of the proletariat. Because the history of the dictatorship of the proletariat is that it ends up, as Rosa Luxemburg often said, into the dictatorship of the party, and then the dictatorship of the party ends up into the dictatorship of the Central Committee. And so that Walter is very careful about these things. And that comes out of his own political experience in Guyana, growing up with a Marxist party in office, the PPP, led by Cheddar Jagan. But also his experience of Forbes Burnham, who declares cooperative socialism, which becomes a kind of cover for authoritarianism, quite frankly. And Burnham becomes a complex figure because he's supportive of African liberation movements and so on, but he's also very much an authoritarian figure. And so the question for democracy for Walter becomes not abstract questions that we can debate in a classroom. It becomes a practical question of how do you organize people? And that the question becomes of democracy and authoritarianism is life and death for him because he's killed. He's finally assassinated by an authoritarian regime. The other point about Walter that I think is important for us is this. At the end of the book on the Guyanese working class, there are these couple of sentences in which Walter says, I have written, and I'm paraphrasing, I have written all this book about the political economy and the Guyanese working class and so on. But you cannot understand the working class without not understanding their cultural formation. And I thought to myself when I read that, my God, this man has written 300 and whatever pages on this remarkable text. And then at the end of it, he really says to us, I don't know if this text has any value. Because for you to say that, then you don't really understand the Guyanese working class unless you understand their culture. And you have written just a remarkable book on the text on the political economy of that, is to undermine what you have written. Not to throw it through the window, but to say, listen, there's something else that we have to pay attention to. And you see, this is, to me, if you're thinking about the black radical tradition, and if you're thinking about particularly what I like, the kind of Caribbean current within this tradition, it comes back to what James writes in Beyond the Boundary, which is ostensibly a book on critic and a kind of semi-autobiography of himself. And there's a section in it in which he says, I have spent, can't remember how many years now, he says, 30, 40 years, writing about history and politics. And I've come to the conclusion, he says, that my history and politics does not tell me everything. He says, what we have to understand is what men, and he's writing in the 60s, 1960, what men want and what men did. And so for me, therefore, this business of what is it that human beings want? What is it that human beings have done, are doing? Then leads me to come back to this business of what I just mentioned briefly, very early on in the interview, of what are our practices? What are our deeds, and how do we theorize it? What is it that we do? And because then you want to come back to something that Fanon and Sylvia Wynter argues, which is that in fact it is what we do that constitutes what we are. Not who we are, but what we are. And so that to think through those kind of things, particularly if you're a radical political intellectual, not as abstractions, but as always thinking in the concrete, to me is what really marks the black radical intellectual tradition. And so that both Walter and CLR, Ida B. Wells, because that is what she was doing concretely. Those figures, Amilcar Cabral from Africa, from Guinea-Bissau, those are the ways in which the kind of methods that they are practicing are, in my view, methods of being intellectuals which are beyond what Marx and Engels and quote-unquote a kind of Western Marxist tradition would talk about, right? And it is this business of the preoccupation with the concrete, and therefore the preoccupation with practices, and therefore a preoccupation with theorizing on both those practices. So Amilcar goes to Havana to speak at the Tricontinental Conference, 1960s. And he gives a speech, and what does he say? He says, Marxism tells me that there's a class struggle and that there's various things. He says, but when I look at my country, I see this, I see that, I see this other thing. And so I have to ask myself, okay, how do I understand my country? And in understanding my country, what revisions to radical theory must I now enact? You see that, and that to me is therefore what one when one thinks about the Black radical tradition. You are saying to yourself, okay, when I look at where I live or where I'm situated, how do I understand it concretely? And in understanding it concretely, how do I develop a theoretical approach to what I understand in the concrete? And also you are saying that in understanding that, I'm not doing it, and this is where Stuart is really important, I'm not doing it in permanency. I'm understanding that this is as very tentative, because things are always in motion. And if I understand it tentatively, then I'm also prepared to adapt and make changes if I am watching the ball and keeping my eye on it.
Well, perhaps that's the challenge that you offer all of us the most, Tony, is to keep our eye on the ball in this conjuncture. You know, as Hall might say, it's the product of many determinations. And so to be trained to how those contradictions fuse is, I think, to take seriously your injunction to focus on the concrete and on people's self-activity. I want to ask if there's anything that I haven't asked that you would like to add.
I mean, I think that one of the important things about the Black radical intellectual tradition is that it has within it a set of political and intellectual and cultural resources which points the way towards freedom. I think that the ways in which the West has constructed freedom has been around political liberty and representative politics, or has been around an understanding of liberal freedom as freedom from, and therefore a dependence on a certain kind of individualism. Not individuality, but individualism. I think one of the things that the Black radical intellectual tradition does, and its politics in particular, is that it suggests that freedom is not normative. That freedom is not just a freedom from or a freedom to, but that freedom is always about a understanding and grappling with a concrete moment in which, as Fanon would put it, our own creative universality can be expressed. But Fanon also says something else, and that is that expression of that creative universality, that ways in which we as human beings have the ability to recreate ourselves endlessly, as he puts it in Black Skin, White Mask, can only be done alongside creating a world of the you. And therefore, within the concept of the Black radical tradition, the meaning of freedom is not about individualism, but is a relational matter. It's about a certain understanding about us as human beings and as a species relating to each other, and relating to each other in ways in which forms of domination and exploitation are absent. That means that you don't get to a place where you say, okay, this is absent and this is freedom. You might get to that place and you say, okay, there's another set of steps that we have to take. There's another set of things that we have to do. Because one of the things about being human is this capacity all the time to take on a set of challenges that face us. And so I think, to think about the world and where we are is also to reflect on that freedom practices within the Black radical tradition. The sets of practices that from Marinage to the ways in which Coltrane plays and his music, to Bob Marley Redemption Song, to think about all those set of practices which essentially free up the human being from what Du Bois would call the arbitrary will of another. And I think that central to that is freedom. And aligned to that, which makes it more complicated than the Western idea of freedom, is that to do that, you have to have forms of equality. Not procedural equality, but forms of radical equality, so that in fact we are all treated as humans. Because central to the Black radical tradition, one question that it puts on the table is actually dignity. What does it mean for a human being to be treated with dignity? And I think all those things combined means that the Black radical tradition has something to offer to those of us who are thinking about what the world would look like on the other side of the River Jordan.
Well, thank you. Professor Anthony Bogues, the director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice here at Brown, also Asa Messer, professor of Humanities and Critical Theory and of Africana Studies. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you, Jordan.